I believe my scariest experience was the first experience I had seeing hallucinations during sleep paralysis. I had a lot of trouble sleeping around the time it happened, and so I had woken up at around 3 to 4 a.m. to a really heavy feeling over my chest and body. I felt like I was getting shocked all over, and I realized, oh, it's just this again. But then I started hearing loud, fast, and distorted whispering in my ears, as if someone was really by my ear talking. When I started realizing I wasn't dreaming anymore, I also began to hear screaming and crying, and then a manic laugh of what seemed an evil clown. I opened my eyes to see if I was alone, just to lay my eyes upon a very large white figure with a big triangle-shaped head that was just looming over my paralyzed, sleeping body. I was so frightened that as soon as I saw him, I didn't even want to look, and so I closed my eyes and wished really hard that nothing would touch me. And throughout that whole visual, I was still hearing the screaming and whispering and laughing. This was the most frightening sleep paralysis because I'd never ever heard voices in my head that weren't actually there, especially of such frightening sounds. I felt like I was in a scary ghost movie. But knowing I could be more in control of my mind than the hallucinations, I closed my eyes and prayed and relaxed, and I told myself it wasn't real. My body started to wake up, even though I was so scared that I cried as soon as my body woke up. I'm proud that I was able to keep structured thoughts. In retrospect, I definitely feel like I ended the experience much sooner than if I hadn't tried to calm myself down and told myself the experience will stop. I've experienced sleep paralysis multiple times in my life. Although it used to happen much more often when I was a kid or a young adult. I'm 43 now. I attribute the lower frequency of these events to how often I am now forcibly awakened by an alarm clock or hyperactive children, as opposed to simply waking up when I feel like to. The vast majority of events follow the typical scenario that has already been described in other answers. I feel awake but unable to move, with a buzzing or drumming sound filling my head. I usually have difficulty to breathe and a feeling of dread, more due to my inability to move than to any external presence, except see below. In my case, the paralysis always happens right before waking, and as others have described, focusing on trying to move a single finger or toe helps me get out of it. As soon as I gain conscious control of any part of my body, I become completely awake. The cases when hallucinations are present are completely different experiences. In those cases, the external presence isn't just obvious, but feels completely real and personal. As a kid, I remember many cases when I experienced waking up and seeing people standing at the foot of my bed. Those people were almost always family members, my parents, my sister, sometimes a grandparent, and were either looking directly at me or engaged in some mundane activity, such as sweeping or making up the bedroom. Everything else in my room looked as I would expect it to look at that time of day. Light coming through the window, clothes from the day before. Except, the uninvited people. In those cases, the feeling of dread didn't come so much from the people looking or acting in a menacing way, but from the simple fact that they shouldn't be there. During the hallucinations, I don't feel as conscious of the paralysis itself. Rather, I find myself thinking I shouldn't move at all until I know what the heck these people are doing. A common theme in these hallucinations is the fact that the figures don't move. They are completely still, as in a snapshot. In fact, the moment I become conscious of that stillness signals the beginning of the end of the hallucination, because then I realize I must be dreaming. At that point, the hallucinations don't simply disappear, but rather start to melt away in the air or dissolve into the background of the room. And once they are completely gone, I am awake. The last hallucination I recall took place in my late 20s. I was single and had guests staying overnight in my apartment. I remember waking up in the morning to the sight of one of my guests observing me from the threshold to my room. This person is a good friend of mine and one of the least threatening people I know, but at the time he looked decidedly ominous. The guy was partially covered in shadows, looking me directly in the eye, and he had sort of a morose expression that I could only interpret as, "Yeah, You caught me watching you sleep. So what? At first sight, it was downright terrifying, and I could feel my heart racing. However, very soon I realized that the situation made no sense, and I noticed that, again, he was not moving at all. At that point, the image started to recede into the shadows on the wall until it disappeared, and then I woke up with a gasp. I was still startled, and for reassurance, I had to take a peek at the other room where, sure enough, my friend was completely asleep. In retrospect, I realized that in all these cases, hallucinations or not, I was actually asleep, but my eyes were probably open and moving since the environment was completely integrated in the experience and didn't change much once I woke up completely. And I was, or thought I was, in complete control of my thoughts. Interestingly, since I learned about what sleep paralysis is, I've been able to wake up from these events much faster and with less anxiety, because as soon as I recognize the situation and say to myself, "This is just a dream," the sense of dread goes away. My scariest sleep paralysis was like a coded cryptic message, which I have not deciphered to this very day. Though the dreadful incident occurred over 2 decades in the past, it happened during the witching hour when the irksome portrait of a decrepit old woman allegedly painted by Salvador Dali when he was only 14 years of age appeared to me in my slumber. I think part of the reason the mysterious personage disturbed me so deeply was because the antiquated portrait somehow reminded me of my deceased maternal grandmother, whom I loved very much. The dry, wrinkly geriatric lips became animated as the faded image told me a vexing story that made no sense at all. I was in a musty room full of people I didn't recognize. There was something threatening about all of them. I felt imminent danger, as though my life were in grave peril. I wanted to get out of that sordid, dreary room. I was desperate to jump up from the settee by the fireplace and run far, far away as fast as I could. But of course I was utterly immobilized by sleep paralysis and therefore could not move a single muscle. I was helpless as a newborn babe. The horror of the hideous thing was unbearable. The weird story the old portrait woman told went like this: Tilde. From an unknown origin far out over the cold, dark North Atlantic, the freak storm surged over the island, knocking out electrical power to the inn. The guests, who were all in their rooms when the place went dark, began peeping furtively out into the shadowy halls to see whether anyone else was about, or if they were all alone in the spooky old inn during a blackout. Candles were lit, and one by one the little groups of guests made their way quietly down the creaking stairs to the parlor, where Stilton had stoked a log blaze in the huge stone fireplace. At first nobody spoke a word, but then someone grew bold enough to inquire when the electricity might be restored, and this prosaic question broke the ice to start a low murmur of uncertain voices. From where he stood by the front doors, Broom saw people creeping by candlelight. He didn't want to go up to his room by himself in the darkness, so he crossed the gloom of the lobby to join the guests gathering in the parlor. The blaze on the stone hearth was throwing vigorously burning red-orange flames up into the chimney. A serpent-like hissing raised gooseflesh as heat from the ravenous flames dried water out of the green logs. Volatile sap in the pine and spruce burst with sharp snaps like firecrackers. Golden glowing sparks clung to the soot-caked, forward-sloping back of the oversized Count Rumford fireplace. The firebrick were chipped and cracked with age. The rising wind moaned and sobbed like a ghost in the smokestack. Outside, the incessant tumult of the slashing gale pounded at the walls and thrashed at the windows. Some of the guests sat motionless, staring silently into the hypnotically dancing flames. Fueled by the grim, unfathomable abyss of the icy North Atlantic, the immutable elementals did, on this dreadful night, wield their mysterious power as a foreshadowing of macabre fate. The guests of Avgrunnan Arms were about to be introduced to the cryptic secret of the 200-year-old haunted seaside inn. Leaving her husband warming himself by the fire, Debbie walked to a section of wall between 2 bookshelves. "What is this unusual painting?" she asked aloud, as if any of the other guests would know something she didn't about the decor of the antediluvian Avgrunnen arms. It looks like a portrait of a woman, yet if so, she doesn't seem to be all there. It's as if she is ethereal, fading in and out. Her complexion, on the one side of her face that is developed enough to discern as human. Well, I don't know. It's somehow sickly looking, eerie. It gives one a chill to look at it. And her hair, she seems to have the features of youth, but her hair appears to be a bluish gray like that of an old woman. See how, like a wild leaping phantom, her long voluminous hair flows out behind her in the night-born sea breeze of the Northern Ocean as it washes through her silvery locks. Debbie, Maud Upton cringed. Your vivid description of that old painting is so ghoulish. Why do you say night-born? Debbie, still closely examining the unorthodox portrait, cocked her head to one side. Well, Maud, the painting is obviously a night scene. Look in the top left corner where the moon rises over her. She seems to float at the railing of a balcony with a rooftop behind her. If I didn't know otherwise, I'd say she is poised atop this very inn. And you would be correct, my dear. Duke Divlin had entered the room unnoticed. Startled, all the guests jumped a little at his authoritative reply. That is a portrait of the blind widow, said he, coming to a stand beside the nervously curious Debbie. The blind widow. Yes, there is quite a haunting tale about her. She was the young bride of the infamous Borkum von Ripper, skipper of the Nightmare. The Nightmare was by far the most prosperous of the whaling vessels, who called Barenfield their home port. Captain von Ripper was notorious as a violent brute, and it was whispered among the villagers that his unusually good luck with whaling came about as a result of him striking a deal with the devil. His young bride's name was Melissa. The painting which you are now admiring is reputed to be a portrait of the young lady, or rather, a portrait of her ghost. Her ghost. Yes, frightfully romantic, isn't it? According to the old stories, her brutish husband was so jealous of her alluring beauty that he imprisoned her in the garret room at the top of this mansion to hide her from the lustful eyes of all the strapping young lads who inhabited the village of Barenfield during its prosperous years as a whaling port. Divlin's eyes spiraled as he recounted the tragic tale, but he released his psychic grip on Debbie for the moment, allowing her to return her dreamy gaze to the spectral painting. The barbaric captain of the Nightmare kept the lovely Melissa locked in attic darkness, only permitting her to come out at night. He didn't even let her light a lantern or candle by which to see her way, because he was determined that no man other than himself should get even the slightest glimpse of his beautiful young wife. She was kept in darkness for so long that her eyes became sensitive to light. A bitter maidservant in the employ of Captain von Ripper saw to it that his despairing spouse remained confined in darkness during his absence. But eventually there was a voyage from which the tyrannical captain did not return. Word of his demise finally reached this island. Captain von Ripper had been killed in a shark attack brought on by the blood of a harpooned whale. When the hateful maidservant received news of the gruesome fate of her wicked master, she dropped dead on the spot. The pretty, yet horribly oppressed Melissa was free at last. She burst from her attic prison and dashed outside into the brilliant sunshine of high noon. She was instantly blinded by the bright daylight. Stumbling and tumbling down the slope to the point, she fell over into the swirling water of the deep Barenfield Harbor entrance channel. A powerful outgoing tide swept the helpless lass out to sea where, sadly, she drowned. The legend of Blind Widow Point, Debbie muttered, gazing trance-like at the ghost portrait of the poor, young wife of the sinister whaling captain. Exactly, her ghost now haunts this antiquated seaside inn. A low rumble of thunder reverberated through the old parlor. The flames in the fireplace crackled, throwing sparks up into the chimney. During the 2 warm months of this island's brief summers, the creepy Divlin continued. The ghost of the blind widow is seen in the courtyard on moonlit nights. She wanders there alone, as if searching for something. She glides around the fountain and through the fragrant balm of the herb garden. In autumn and winter, whenever the weather is particularly violent, such as it is tonight, She stalks the widow's walk, gazing with her dark, hollow eye sockets out over the sloshing swells of the North Atlantic, sobbing and weeping for that which she has lost. Many guests at Avgrunnen Arms have seen her, a traveling artist who came here to paint seascapes along the rugged Barrenfield shoreline, rendered this oil sketch of the blind widow. It is a sorrowful and haunting painting, but guests who have seen the grieving ghost confirm that the artist's portrait is a good likeness of the forlorn apparition. Suddenly, Divlin turned his head sharply as if he had heard a noise which troubled him. He stared in silence for a moment at the shadowed corridor outside the parlor, then abruptly said, "Excuse me for a moment, won't you?" Nodding a stately farewell to Debbie and the other guests, he walked swiftly from the room and disappeared into the dark recesses of the old inn. "Well, that was weird," Prissy quipped sarcastically in a coquettish attempt to lure attention from the twin boys. It worked. They came to sit beside her, one at her left, the other at her right. On the long sofa, Penny, who was holding her pale hands out to the blaze in the fireplace, eyed the flirtation with contempt. She looked away and huffed in disgust. The hour was growing late on this dark and stormy night. There was a chill of ill boding in the grave atmosphere of the Gothic parlor. Gradually, everyone huddled closer to the fulgent log fire, which the bellboy had stoked higher than usual due to the unexpected emergency. The guests thought they remembered seeing the bellboy when they began entering the parlor, although no one knew where he was at the moment. Nobody could figure out how Stilton had built up such a big blazing fire then disappeared without being noticed. The scorching conflagration roared furiously up the chimney. Wildly gyrating shadows thrown by the flickering red-orange flames cast a suspicious mood over everyone in the room. The crackling log fire wickedly animated cheerless faces. When would the electricity be restored? When would the lights come back on? This foreboding incident of sleep paralysis left such a profound and lasting impact upon me that I arranged it as a gloomy chapter in a mystery novel I wrote entitled Bloodstone and Broomcorn, Curse of the Witch.